There were a few things in this that I thought made me think about sort of an established concept or thing that happened already in a totally different way. One of them was, we brought up already, we kind of always assumed that Sean McVay just did a smart thing when they hired him as this youngest head coach to go get an established, smart, defensive-minded guy and just leave him to the defense. You know, like, let's get somebody who knows what they're doing, and I'll step away, and now I have this guy. But actually, it sounds like it was much more, I'm going to go get a really smart defensive mind, because going against that every single day will help this side of the ball, regardless of what it does to the other side, and then kind of redid it again with Brandon Staley. But the other thing I think that was interesting is we sort of view it as eventually Sean McVay just decided that Jared Goff wasn't good enough, couldn't hit the heights needed to execute the offense the way it needed to be executed to take this team to winning a Super Bowl, and Matthew Stafford was the guy that ended up being the player that could. But the way it's sort of described or articulated with those two things being connected, did Sean McVay actually break Jared Goff by going to Brandon Staley as his defensive coordinator, by deliberately pitting his offense against the most difficult thing in the league for it to go up against? It sort of broke Jared Goff's confidence and broke him down, as opposed to, building up a young quarterback who still needed to develop.
Well, I definitely wouldn't put any words in Jared Goff's mouth. I think he's doing fabulously, obviously, in Detroit. And that time, to me, instead of, I think part of this is we always want there to be like a hero and a villain of any split that happens in any team. And this really wasn't the case. It was more a case of pacing, right? Because Sean McVay's pace after 2018, losing to Bill Belichick and the Patriots, when they borrowed concepts from that same defense that Sean McVay ended up installing in-house in Los Angeles 2 years later, Sean McVay's pace changed. He went from this coach who was basically just doing stuff because it felt right, and it was leading to a lot of wins, and they were sort of starting to sprint at a pace that was frenetic until they hit a brick wall, almost literally. And then the pacing changed, because at that time, when you're working with Jared Goff, you're building together, you're working on things that help your quarterback become a function of the offense, and vice versa. But once you realize that you're at the level that it takes to contend for Super Bowls, but you need to make sure that you're pushing these pieces all together that can also match your pace. The matching and pace became different between Jared, who I think we forget a lot of times was still a developing quarterback, very young quarterback, even though we forget it because he went to the Super Bowl so early in his career, was still developing. And the pace of that development changed and dramatically juxtaposed to the pace of the head coach who, in his own words, had started this maniacal pursuit toward getting back to the Super Bowl and winning it after that loss that was so embarrassing for him. And a lot of times when we see teams move on from players either outgrow teams or teams outgrow players, it's a question of pace, not necessarily personal feelings or frustration. And I think my opinion is that seeing that pace, being reminded of that pace change and that juxtaposition over and over and over again in those practices, because every day was about getting presented the toughest look you could possibly imagine. Andrew Whitworth speaks really well in the series about what that did for the entire offense in terms of shaking its confidence a little bit. Oh, maybe we're not as good as we thought we were. Maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe we have to start thinking differently about certain things. Well, that's inclusive to the quarterback. And so when those things start to happen over and over and over again in practice, and then you start strong in the season, but then you start losing games and practices are getting even worse, you're starting to really recognize, if I, as a head coach, because Sean McVay is the one who pounded the table for Matthew Stafford, if I'm the head coach and I need to stay at this pace or risk losing it altogether, I need to make a change. And also on the other side, I think Jared Goff did need to go to a place where his development would continue in a natural arc and not sort of hit this crazy vertical shot the way that Sean McVay had expected him to do so.
there's so many more voices in this podcast than, you know, just the ones that get top billing, right? Those guys on the poster for the thing. Was there anybody in there that you found sort of most compelling of all the different personalities? Because all these guys are really interesting people, but there was one that jumped out to me. I'm curious if any jumped out to you.
Well, I will say, first of all, shout out to Robert Saleh, who did try to completely steal the show from the offensive guys with the quality and caliber of his interview and some of the anecdotes that he told that people, I think, will really enjoy, specifically in episodes 1 and 3. But Mike McDaniel stood out to me among the core characters because of his candidness. I think they were all extremely candid, and what I think people will enjoy is hearing, you know, Kyle Shanahan and Matt LaFleur especially talk about football in a way that they don't often talk about it at the podiums that they're on, and be very, you know, with Kyle, like sometimes his obsessiveness about the sport and the way that he thinks about it, it bleeds through in his voice, and you can really hear that. But Mike McDaniel, I thought, was extremely candid, not just about the way he thinks about, you know, the dynamics between all of them, but also the way he thinks about football, the way he comes up with plays, how he thinks about calling plays. He talks, he has this dialogue out loud as he troubleshoots things with himself, but the gift was that he let it be heard. You know, he wasn't sort of talking in his own mind. He was talking through these ideas and these theories that he had out loud into a microphone. And to me, that really struck me as, you know, I don't know Mike McDaniel very well before this, right? Because I'm on the other side of the country. You know, I know him through sort of stories and people around him and Kyle Shanahan, and I think he really emerges as a very key personality within this series as someone who does epitomize, you know, being a little bit different in terms of what we consider a historic traditional football coach. All these guys are in different ways, but Mike McDaniel, the way he talks and the way that he expresses his ideas certainly struck out to me for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because McDaniel was the one that jumped out to me as well. What I found really interesting about McDaniel is that he was open about the way his mind was working in an interpersonal level in a way that some of these other guys didn't necessarily touch on. Not because they weren't thinking it necessarily, just because they didn't articulate that. But, you know, McDaniel would talk about how he deliberately went and learned the run game because that would kind of get him in favor with Kyle Shanahan. Whereas, you know, Shanahan's talking with LaFleur and McVay and it's all pass game all the time. And he sort of calculated that if he's going to be heard in this, you know, like almost like a kind of mama bird with all the chicks, you know, if he was going to find the worm, he was going to have to make himself unique, and being able to like articulate those kinds of things, or not being able to, but being willing to, I found pretty interesting with him in this series.
Yeah, I think one of the most telling anecdotes of that tells you so much about what you need to know about the dynamic between coaches, not just these coaches, but most, if not all coaches, was Mike McDaniel's story about how you have to understand the foundation of the relationship between all of these guys was Kyle Shanahan was the boss, and he was training all of these guys who wanted to know what he knows, and they say this in their own words. And at the same time, they were all competing with each other every single day, very vocally, to get calls onto Kyle's call sheet for games. And that would mean that you're making progress. That is a tangible in a building where Mike Shanahan is never letting you know where you stand by design. Having a tangible call on the call sheet or something that you do being used in games is the only way that you can see that you're making progress as a coach toward this dream and this goal of yours to be a head coach. And so all of that manifests on Kyle Shanahan's call sheet. And so Mike McDaniel's most telling anecdote of the dynamic between what that must have been like was he starts creating these plays with Chris Furster at the time, the offensive line coach, and they're talking about the run game. And he decides that he's going to let Kyle Shanahan, he's going to present the play, and if it gets approved, he's going to let Kyle Shanahan name the play. Because if there's ownership in that regard, Mike McDaniel believed that there was a better chance of that call making it onto the call sheet. So who cares what the name is? Everybody would know, everybody internally would know that that's a Mike McDaniel play. And so that dynamic, finding those little leverages and those little minute advantages, even with your own coworkers, I think paints this picture of what it really is like to work on that side of things and to exist on that side of things, especially when combined with the fact that these guys are and always have been wholly obsessive in their pursuit of the ultimate goal of becoming a head coach, and starting to all realize as well what that toll is and what it costs to stay at that level.